Hi everyone, I'm Any New Province, and this week we're going to find out if Growth Spiral is possibly Pauper Playable. I was just as excited as the rest of the community when I heard Growth Spiral had been spoiled. It gives you the ability to put a land into play at instant speed. Growth Spiral costs green, blue for an instant and allows you to draw a card and then put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. This is going to do all kinds of cool stuff. You can cheat an extra Tron land into play early. You can Bazooka Bog your opponent at instant speed to fizzle their Ghostly Flicker or their Pulsamarasa target, or you can do what I did and jam it into a deck full of moonfolk so that you can repeatedly get triggers off of spell lands. So that's exactly what I did. I built this deck Spiral Lands to repeatedly put spell lands onto the battlefield with moonfolk and scouts. Before I get into the deck tech, I just want to let you know that you can like the video or subscribe to the channel down below. I'd seriously appreciate it. It's a great way to let me know you're enjoying everything, and it really encourages me to keep making great Pauper content. Alright, let's have a look at Spiral Lands. Growth Spiral only gives you the ability to put a land into play at instant speed a single time. We're going to want to do it over and over again, so I've included spells like Sakura Tribe Scout to do exactly that. Sakura Tribe Scout costs 1 green mana for a 1/1, and you can tap it to put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. We're also running 1 copy of Llanowar Scout. It costs 1 green for a 1/1, and it also allows you to put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. I prefer the 1-cost Sakura Tribe Scout because we can get it down, hopefully, before our opponent can interact with it and get some value that way. It would be great if our grip was always full of lands for us to commit to the battlefield at instant speed with our Sakura Tribe Scout and Llanowar Scout. However, I've also included the Moonfolk Tribe to help get those lands into our hand when we need to. First, we have Oboro Breezecaller, which costs 1 and a blue for a 1/1 flyer that allows you to pay 2 generic mana, return a land you control to its owner's hand, and untap target land. The cost of Oboro Breezecaller's ability is almost useful enough on its own. However, its ability to untap lands will give us enough mana to keep triggering its ability, keep picking up lands, and keep putting them back on the battlefield with our scouts. I'm also running a single copy of Soratami Cloud Skater, which costs 1 and a blue for a 1/1 flyer that lets you pay 2 generic mana, return a land you control to its owner's hand, draw a card, then discard a card. While I am a bigger fan of Breezecaller's ability to generate its own mana when activating its ability multiple times, I still like Soratami Cloud Skater's ability to filter our draws and sometimes synergize with one of our spell lands. First, we have Sunscorched Desert. Sunscorched Desert comes into the battlefield and deals 1 damage to target player or planeswalker. It only adds generic mana, but it allows this deck some reach if our opponent's board is too clogged up for us to attack through with our Breezecallers and our Cloud Skater. Next, we have Radiant Fountain, which also only adds colorless mana, but it gains you 2 life and it comes into the battlefield untapped. Our deck is going to need a way to survive for a very long time. Gaining a ton of life with Radiant Fountain is going to be important. Next up, we have Mortuary Mire, which is a pretty interesting card when you can play it multiple times in the same turn. Mortuary Mire enters the battlefield and allows you to put target creature from your graveyard on top of your library. We're all well aware of how interactive the Pauper format is, and one of the downfalls of my last lands deck was that it could be picked apart so easily. Mortuary Mire is going to allow us to go into our graveyard and get back those important creatures we need to continue comboing off. Next up, we have Colony Garden, which enters the battlefield tapped and creates a 0/1 green plant creature token, which is great for Edict fodder, but it can also be an attacker in our deck. I'll get into that eventually. We're running Sajiri's Step, which, while being off color, is an incredibly powerful spell land. It enters the battlefield tapped and gives a creature you control protection from the color of your choice until end of turn. Not only can we pick this up and put it back onto the battlefield multiple times at instant speed once our board is set up, we also have ways to tutor up Sajiri's Step at instant speed to put onto the battlefield, fizzling one of our opponent's removal spells. This is just a great spell land to have, even if it is off color. Next is my favorite spell land. It's Skyline Cascade. It enters the battlefield tapped, and it makes target creature and opponent control unable to untap on their next untap step. Basically, Skyline Cascade works in our deck as a 1 creature fog, and if we can commit it to the battlefield multiple times while our opponent has tapped creatures, we can keep locking them down so they'll be unable to attack us. Finally, we have Bazooka Bog, the most ubiquitous spell land in the Pauper format. It enters the battlefield tapped, and when it enters the battlefield, you get to exile all cards from target player's graveyard. This should help us shut down those Ghostly Flicker loops and those Gurmag Angler decks. It's great when our lands entering the battlefield have useful effects, but sometimes the board state works out in a way that the lands won't be useful on their own. For that reason, we've got some payoffs payoffs for just puking lands onto the battlefield all the time. First, we have Jauti Offshoot, kind of a response to the amount of burn we've been seeing in the metagame recently. Jauti Offshoot costs 1 mana for a 0/3 defender, and when a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. I've also included some ramp payoffs because our scouts are going to get us up to a ridiculous amount of mana early in the game sometimes when we have multiple land cards in our hand to commit to the battlefield with them. Our first ramp payoff is Capsize. It costs 1 blue and it has buyback 3 generic mana, which means you may pay an additional 3 generic mana as you cast Capsize. If you do, you get to take it back after it resolves. It returns target permanent to its owner's hand. We can start running out Capsize with buyback as early as turn 4 in some games. If our opponent has been committing a bunch of Karoo lands to the battlefield, this is going to be absolutely backbreaking. Also, if our opponent is leaning on Gurmag Anglers to end the game, we can keep putting them back into their hand, making them use their entire graveyard or just pay tons of mana to continue attacking us. Finally, we also have a few of our own Gurmag Anglers because we're going to be dumping stuff into our graveyard with our growth spirals and some of the cantrips I'll get into later, but also if we can just get up to 6 or 7 mana with our scouts, we can cast these on turn 4 too. Gurmag Angler costs 6 and a black, but it has Delve, which means each card you exile from your graveyard while casting Gurmag Angler pays for 1 generic mana in its mana cost. It's a 5/5. We're going to be using a lot of resources just to set up in the early game, so I've included some card advantage and card filtering to allow us to keep drawing into gas after our hand is empty. Our first source of card advantage is Vulturous Aven. It costs 3 and a black for a 2/3 with flying, and it also has Exploit, which means when Vulturous Aven enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice a creature. If you do, you get to draw 2 cards and lose 2 life. Vulturous Aven and putting Mortuary Mire onto the battlefield at instant speed interacts in a really interesting way. You can play Vulturous Aven, sacrifice it to its Exploit ability, and with the draw trigger on the stack, flash in your Mortuary Mire, get back your Vulturous Aven with its ability and a new card. If you have tons of mana, you can just repeatedly do this, filling up your hand and using up that life you've gained from Jauti Offshoot. We're also running 4 copies of Preordain because, let's face it, Preordain is just one of the most powerful spells in Pauper altogether. It costs 1 blue mana for a sorcery and allows you to scry 2, then draw a card. Finally, we're running 2 copies of Brainstorm because this deck runs a ton of shuffle effects, so we'll usually be able to take advantage of Brainstorm's full power. Brainstorm costs 1 blue mana for an instant and allows you to draw 3 cards, then put 2 cards from your hand back on top of your library in any order. Like I said, we have a lot of shuffle effects, so after we draw our 3 cards and put back 2 cards we don't want, we shuffle our library, they go away, and we've got a brand new grip. Our last package is full of tutors because we're only running 1 copy of most of the useful lands we're controlling. We also have 1 copy of some useful artifacts that we're going to tutor up with this spell, Trinket Mage. Trinket Mage costs 2 and a blue for a 2/2, and when it enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an artifact card with converted mana cost 1 or less. You reveal that card and put it into your hand. If you do, shuffle your library. Pretty good with Brainstorm. The first artifact we can tutor up is a Nihil Spellbomb, which costs 1 generic mana and allows you to tap and sacrifice it to exile all cards from target player's graveyard. When it's put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you can pay black. If you do, draw a card. Nihil Spellbomb not only gives us the ability to tack 2 mana on the top of Trinket Mage's mana cost to just draw a new card, it controls our opponent's graveyard. So if we're facing Tron and we're into the late game and we just need a way to disrupt that Ghostly Flicker, Nihil Spellbomb is going to do the trick. We're also running 3 copies of Expedition Map, Trinket Mage functionally being the 4th copy. It costs 1 generic mana for an artifact that you can pay 2, tap, and sacrifice to search your library for a land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. Expedition Map really does everything you want it to in this deck. It goes into your library, gets one of those interesting lands, and puts it into your hand to commit to the battlefield at instant speed with some of your scouts. Also, it kind of helps with our sketchy 3-color mana base. Our last Trinket Mage target is Adventuring Gear, and I love having a second functional copy of it in the deck using our tutor. This costs 1 generic mana, and when a land enters the battlefield under your control, equipped creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. Our Vulturous Avens and Cloud Skaters and Breeze Callers all wear Adventuring Gear very well because they're flyers. We're going to be able to put lands onto the battlefield multiple times in a turn and hopefully make these creatures enormous enough to win the game. Also, this is really useful with Colony Garden. Those plant tokens don't have defenders, so if we can recur it, we can just keep sending huge plant tokens at our opponent to create a kind of abyss. Finally, our last non-land card is Crop Rotation. It costs 1 green mana. As an additional cost to cast it, you sacrifice a land and you can search your library for a land card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. Crop Rotation is just another great way for us to cheat lands into the battlefield at instant speed, and it's another tutor for all of our very specific one-of spell lands. It's a little risky to run something that sacrifices lands in Pauper though, so we're only including 3 copies. Alright, let's have a look at this mana base. The rest of our non-basics include 4 Karoo lands, 1 Dimir Aqueduct, and 3 Simic Growth Chambers. Karoo lands enter the battlefield tapped, make you pick up a land, and when they're untapped, they tap for 2 mana of their guild's colors. We're also running 4 copies of Evolving Wilds. This is an additional shuffle effect for Brainstorm. It's another land entering the battlefield when we need it to for our Jauti Offshoots and our Adventuring Gear, and it helps us fix our 3-color mana base. For basics, we have 3 forests, forests, 1 island, and 1 swamp. It does kind of suck to have to run this few basic lands because it means most of our lands are going to enter the battlefield tapped. However, we can squeeze in just enough to sometimes commit a Sakura Tribe Scout on turn 1 and really get those lands flowing. Alright, let's have a look at this sideboard. First, we have 4 copies of Hydroblast for fighting against burn spells and red removal spells. We have 3 copies of Chainer's Edict to deal with boggles and heroic creatures, and 1 copy of Deadweight to stick on tireless tribes. We have 2 copies of Pulse Marasa for buffering our life total or buying back creatures in those really interactive matchups. We have 2 copies of Claws of Wirewood if our opponent is going wide in the air with flyers. We can protect our own flyers with Tajiri Steps. We have 3 copies of Nihil Spellbomb to control our opponent's graveyards in matchups like Tron. And there you have it, Spiral Lands. We're going to be taking this deck into a league at 7 p.m. Atlantic time this Tuesday night at twitch.tv/AnyNewProvince. We're there every Tuesday night playing Possibly Pauper Playable decks. Before I go, I just want to remind you that you can like the video or subscribe to the channel down below. I'd seriously appreciate it. It's a great way to let me know you've enjoyed everything, and it really encourages me to keep making great Pauper content. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully, I'll see you on Tuesday night.